day 3a. God separates the land and the sea. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the land earth, and he called the gathering of the water seas. And God saw that it was good. Well, here I was thinking, finally, an easy creation day to write about. This day won't be like the first 2 days with all that airy-fairy stuff that really only God knows what happened. At long last, we have got to something that is not beyond my imagination. I know what the earth looks like. I stand on it every day. I have walked barefooted, feeling the wet earth squish between my toes. I've felt the hard earth start to burn my feet and make me regret not having thongs on. I have flown in a plane, looking out at the land, way, way down there, beneath me, spreading out forever. I have seen photos of the earth from space. I actually even remember parts of my school lessons on the earth. I was confident I knew about the earth. There would be no questions here. I know what the sea looks like. I have been to the beach. I have walked on the sand, feeling the tug of the waves. And as kids, we, my brother and sister and I, and then years later my children, we all suffered the same angst as waves from the incoming tide destroyed our carefully built sandcastle. And at school, I had learned how the moon affects the tides and about the sea, the cloud, rain, water evaporation cycle. So I was confident I knew about the sea. There would be no surprises here. And even if you are one of the people who has never had the desire or the opportunity to go to the beach, I am reasonably confident you too have been taught about the sea and have seen pictures of the sea. Therefore, like me, the earth and the sea would not be beyond your imagination. Well, that's what I thought until I started researching for this third day of creation. Then, as I started thinking and questioning about this separation of land and sea, I actually started to question why? And questioning, by the way, is a good thing. As the New Scientist site, quoting Albert Einstein on its front page said, the important thing is to not stop questioning. And fair dinkum, this is very important for us Christians to realise too. Sadly, I realised that I had never, ever stopped to think and to question, why doesn't the sea, when the tide is coming in, overtake the earth? Like, yeah, I knew the moon controls the tides, but I never gave it a single thought as to why doesn't the water go further inland. Yet, according to scientists, there is enough water in the Earth's oceans to cover the Earth up to just over 3.2 kilometres high, or 2 miles for us oldies. And some of the beaches I have visited are reasonably flat, and people have had to build walls to prevent the high tide from reaching their houses. But think about those places where there are no natural or man-made barriers. And so this led to my question, okay, why does the sea stop and not just keep going and cover all the land? But there was this smart 12-year-old girl with a very inquisitive mind who asked that very question. Nearly all the answers given were not in context, as they were in relation to Noah's flood, as to whether the flood could or couldn't have happened. And those answers are for another day's question message, if ever given it. The site judged the best answer to be evaporation from the sun causing the sea level to remain constant. Well, I suppose that could kind of work for the way the Earth is now, but it still doesn't make quite complete sense. As I said earlier, there is enough seawater to completely cover the Earth up to 3.2 kilometres or 2 miles high. And yes, the evaporation cycle is keeping all that water at a constant level. But there is still enough water in the ocean to cover the land. So that can't be all that is stopping the water from completely covering the Earth. But so far in my research, I hadn't been able to find even one scientific reason for why the water stopped covering the Earth in the first place. We need to remember there was no sun or moon yet to create tides. That doesn't happen until day 4, well, tomorrow, according to the narrative. It was funny, not in a ha-ha sort of way, but I really struggled with there not being a scientific explanation as to why originally the waters stopped covering the Earth. I couldn't get why, in what I had read, no one talked about how the waters stopped covering the Earth. But you see, then I discovered how scientists had proposed the Earth was initially bone dry, and they had developed these lovely, complicated, long-time scenarios as to how water originally formed on the Earth. Well, it kind of sort of made sense, but still there is lots of water covering the Earth now, and as we all know, the water covering the Earth isn't of the same quality. The seawater, which is, salty, covers 70% of the Earth's surface, whereas there's actually only 1% that is drinkable water. Now, what I did find in my research is some very interesting anomalies in scientific thinking that showed to me just how far scientists will take their theories to remove God from the equation. You see, some scientists claim that Mars, whose surface is drier than an old bone, was originally completely covered in water, but the Earth, which is around 70% of its surface covered by water, was bone dry as it was formed. Now, I'm no scientist, but to my mind, that doesn't make sense. Naturally, they can't really explain why Mars now has no water and yet the Earth does. Some of the stuff I read was like the same scenario in reverse for each planet. Interestingly, I found how scientists are saying that because they have found the possibility of a large saline lake on Mars, that life could have existed on Mars and Mars can become habitable. Yet the Earth, which according to their thinking was originally dry, now has water and is definitely habitable? What? There are two things we need to stop and think about here. Firstly, how the scientific idea that there was water on Mars actually does support the Bible's declaration of deep water originally covering literally everything in the world and universe in the beginning of day 2. And secondly, how scientists admit water is needed to create life. And I find it exciting to think how we have the Bible claiming before there was any scientific evidence that there was this great deep water covering the Earth right there at the very beginning of the world. Now, what I don't get is how come, if scientists affirm that water is needed to create life, then how come there is life on Earth, which they say had no water, and yet there is no sign of life on Mars, which apparently was flooded with water? And as I'm sure you are aware, they have certainly looked very, very hard and long for the sign of life on Mars. Yes, I do know there are other variables like extreme heat, etc., as to why there is no life on Mars. Yet I'm sure we all know that according to evolutionary thinking, how the needed characteristics for survival adapt over time. So if we are to go according to evolutionary thinking, surely any life that began in the waters of Mars would have evolved and adapted to live in the strange atmosphere, the salty water, and the extra extreme heat from the sun? But have you thought about this? The great watery deep did not need anything else for survival. There was no need to adapt. There were no land boundaries. It could go wherever it liked. At this stage there was no moon or sun to control its movements, or wind to send its chaotic waves in a particular direction. It was unaware of its chaos, or that it really wasn't capable of producing one teeny tiny bit of microscopic life. And of course, it didn't care one iota that due to its great depth, that life could not exist in the Earth's current watery state. But God cared. He wanted life. He wanted a living, thriving kingdom. So God gathered the sea into one place and caused the land to appear. Now, what I found interesting is how the Old Testament biblical authors didn't copy the surrounding nations' views on how the earth sat on a large animal or was held up by a giant named Atlas. Actually, what I did find as I searched the Bible for clues as to what God did to make the land and the sea separate is that despite the modern viewpoint that Old Testament people were unintelligent and did not possess any of the scientific knowledge we are lucky to have, no, that's not what I saw. You see, the Old Testament authors actually give some very compelling word pictures that match up with scientific explanations. And we see this with Job as he's railing against God because of his unbearable situation. And at one point, Job describes God's work on day 3 with hangs on nothing. Yet it wasn't around to 4,000 or 5,000 years later, in 1650, that scientists discovered the earth does indeed hang on nothing. Then we have Elihu explaining to Job how God is exalted beyond our knowledge, for he makes water drops and they still the rain into its midst, which the clouds pour out and shower abundantly on people. Elihu's discussion with Job is believed to have taken place somewhere between 2000 and 1000 years BC. And from this and other statements, we can see they had a good understanding of how the water cycle worked. Yet it wasn't until 3,000 to 4,000 years later, in 1700 AD, that a Swedish physicist, Niels Bohr, ran repeated experiments over 8 years and confirmed that these were the characteristics of evaporation. And then we hear King Solomon, when he was describing wisdom, saying how wisdom is shown in God's creation as he goes, "The Lord formed me, wisdom, before the earth began. Yes, at the beginning of his creation, wisdom, was there. He established the heavens when he laid out the horizon on the surface of the ocean, when the fountains of the ocean gushed out, when he set a limit for the sea so that the waters would not violate his command, when he laid out the foundations of the earth." And then the prophet Jeremiah, who as God's spokesman, well, he kind of gets politically incorrect as he rebukes the Israelites, going, "Hear this, you senseless and foolish people. You have eyes, but you don't see. You have ears, but you don't hear. Do you not fear me?" Oh, by the way, this fear is not a cowering, fearful fear, but a worshipful submission, a reverential awe, and obedient respect. This is the Lord's declaration. Do you not tremble before me, the one who set the sand as the boundary of the sea, an enduring barrier that it cannot cross? The waves surge, but they cannot prevail. They roar, but cannot pass over it. So do you see how both Solomon and Jeremiah understood that it doesn't appear logical for the sea to have this invisible barrier at the sandy beach where the sea just goes so far and stops and recedes back into itself? And it's obvious they both knew well what I was slowly learning as I prepared this message, how it was at God's spoken command that caused the sea to stop, and how it was by God's command the sea was not allowed to go any further inland. Yep, the sea and the earth are so much more complicated and connected and necessary to our life than I had been taught. It was fascinating reading about how the ocean's various tides, their different currents and waves contribute to this global conveyor belt that plays a key role in keeping the ocean and world healthy by distributing heat energy, regulating the weather and climate, and cycling vital nutrients and gases. And then it was cool discovering that in 2000, a guy called Jacobson found 700 kilometers down in the earth water hidden inside a blue rock called rigwoodite. And this reservoir of water contains 3 times the volume of all the oceans. And yet it's uncanny how the psalmist paints that very picture with these words. He spread the land on the waters. Unfortunately, too many of us Christians tend to see God like some kind-hearted grandfatherly figure who is giving us tall stories with his creation explanation, instead of giving us all the nitty-gritty details. So they miss out on seeing him as a mighty, powerful God and believing in faith how by his powerful spoken word he created literally everything. And another thing we Christians often fail to realize is that, well, God actually isn't obliged to explain anything at all to us. You see, God, when he's sternly questioning Job, and that gives Job and now us this vivid picture of God's power and control over the world he created, as he goes, get ready to answer me like a man when I question you. Where were you when I established the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who fixed its dimensions? Certainly you know. Who enclosed the sea behind doors? When it burst from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its blanket, when I determined its boundaries and put its bars and doors in place, when I declared, you come this far, but no further. Your proud waves stop here. God is pointing out to Job that as the powerful and wise God of creation, he does not have to explain anything to Job if he so chooses. And the same goes for us. Yet while God doesn't have to explain things to people, we should be questioning and looking for answers and seeking to learn and understand more about how the good world God created for us works. Like right now, crystals are all the go for their healing properties. And in some ways, this is nothing new actually, as people for eons have been fascinated by crystals with their various colours, along with its amazing ability to refract light and its paradox of being transparent, but also looking dark. And they have attributed many different qualities to these rocks, one of which is that the vibrations in a crystal will heal you. In 2015, a person asked a physics question site whether there was any scientific basis behind crystal energy, or is it purely metaphysical pseudoscience? There was some discussion showing the crystals do have internal energy, but the consensus was nothing more special energy-wise than any other materials. But then in 2016, a research paper concluded that it is possible to absorb electromagnetic radiation using an anisotropy electrophic crystal, in other words, a hexagonal boron nitride. Now, of course, whether crystals will heal you is a discussion for another day. But scientists are excited because this knowledge will help them when designing absorbing devices and sensors that operate in the infrared range. But while reading the 2 research papers, I realized that crystals that I thought was a solid rock, well, they're not so solid. They have all these photons bouncing around, creating wavelengths. Yet again, I learned there is far more to this earth and its rocks than I had realized. And our God created all these vastly different rock forms with their different and unique properties. I am beginning to understand, and perhaps you are too, that we will never fully know and comprehend all the intricacies of God's creative work. And it makes me wonder what God thinks when scientists develop a theory about the origins of the world, that they purport to be a new way of understanding how the earth was formed without any involvement from God. And yet the biblical authors were painting that exact same picture in easy to understand terms thousands of years prior to their new scientific discovery. And scientists will continue questioning the origin of our beginning, as they should. And they will continue coming up with all sorts of interesting theories as to what the earth was like in the beginning and how it was formed. And depending on their starting point, sometimes they'll be wide of the mark because of the desire to remove God from the equation. And sometimes, as we have seen, despite their best efforts to remove God from the equation, their theories and scientific discoveries were described in the Bible eons ago. But as they, or us, weren't there at the beginning of the creation, no one will ever have the whole story except God. Scientists can only explain how the earth began from their starting assumption of long ages with either well-educated theories or poorly thought out theories. And what is cool is that since I first wrote this sermon in 2018, is how in 2020 articles were starting to come out in the mainstream media explaining how scientists, when testing the earth, have realized that water did cover the earth at the very beginning. So just who was first to record the idea that water covered the earth? The Bible did. And non-believers everywhere will go, nah, couldn't be. It has to be the scientists. Now, as we have talked about previously, the biblical history of creation was written to explain to the surrounding nations there was only one God who created the world and everything in it, and this is the God. And so when people look at creation, it should point them to this God as the powerful God above all gods who could create such a good world. And as Paul so aptly puts it, God is rightly annoyed at people who suppress the truth by exchanging the truth of God for a lie. For even though they knew God, they did not glorify him as they should. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And after all, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and his divine nature have clearly been seen and understood since the creation of the world and what God made. This means people have no excuse. The point of God giving us a small glimpse into his creation work is not so we waste time wondering about the hows or whys of creation, but so we can realize how incredibly complex creation is, and that complexity will point us to the powerful God who created it all and has the power in his word to stop the sea. And isn't that power clearly seen in the New Testament gospel narrative describing Jesus asleep in the boat as this furious storm was raging, and his scared disciples wake him up. And what does Jesus do? Well, he rebukes the wind and commands the waves, "Quiet, be still." The wind dies down, and it was completely calm. And look at the disciples' response. They too knew, just like Solomon and Jeremiah did, that it was God who commanded the sea to stop at the very beginning in time. And so naturally, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him?" They knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, only God has that kind of power. So they were now beginning to think, oh, so just who is this Jesus? His spoken word has just stopped the waves. They obey him. And that is just like what God did in the very beginning when he created the world. Could it be? Is it possible that Jesus could actually be God? And shouldn't it be even more so for us? Shouldn't we be stopping and thinking how the creation of the sea and the land helps point us to our powerful God, as we come to realize that our God's creation work is even beyond not just simple old me, but the scientists' complete understanding and knowledge. Yes, the creation of the earth and the sea is certainly not simple, nor is it straightforward. And as we have learned, they are far more complicated than they appear. Sadly, we have believed the lie that the hows and whys are not told to us in the Bible. And that lie will be discussed another day. But what we do need to know now is that the creation account was written because God wanted us to look at his creation and see the God who did the creating and go, wow, look at God's wisdom and power as shown in his creation. What we need to consider is whether we should be wasting time worrying about the how of creation, or should we be more worrying about our lives showing to the people around us the power and wisdom of God's powerful word in separating the land and sea, and then commanding the sea to go no further, and how his power is witnessed in Jesus' power over the storm. Now, if you're already showing to the people around you that you are 100% confident in God's powerful word as seen in creation, go you. You are so blessed. But if you are not that confident of God's powerful word, then really and truly, I can assure you, I was actually kind of like you before researching for this message. I believe God spoke the truth, but at the same time, I wasn't 100% positive. I can promise you that now I believe we Christians can be completely confident that the biblical account of creation does show us the power of God and the wisdom contained in his spoken word, and how that power has been witnessed by 12 very scared people through God's Son Jesus' command over the sea and waves, proving how Jesus was the powerful commanding word spoken at the very beginning. So I pray that you too will be gaining the same confidence in God's powerful word shown throughout the creation narrative. Amen.